Okay, so now we're on to the essay, which is how similar were the colonies in North America in 1740. So obviously we can discuss this and we've got to like separate it. The key thing here is, I think, with this question is um, which colonies? They haven't really specified. So I believe you can attack this either with the British colonies, North, Middle, and South, or the British versus the French versus the Spanish. I think they're kind of angling for French, Spanish, British, but I think you could kind of go whichever way you wanted to with this. What do you think? What's your take on
I
it?
I, I agree. I would be inclined. I think the easier one is to compare them to the French and Spanish colonies.
I think so, but I think it's also interesting to tack on. What I would do is compare them with the French and Spanish colonies, and then tack on because I would break this economic, social, political. I think would be the most logical ones for this one to make your life easier.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that makes a lot of
comparison.
sense, actually.
And then I would do a little bit of internal British, British colony comparison tacked on the end of my paragraphs. After you're dealing with how similar or different are they predominantly. Um, so which one should we start with? Political, social, or economic?
Let's start with the political.
Okay, cool. So I'll go and then you can add bits on. So I think politically, obviously, between the French, Spanish, and British, they're pretty different. Britain at that point was, I believe, the most democratic country in the world. Certainly, there weren't many, because obviously the Civil War meant that Parliament had beaten the king. Power resided with Parliament. Whereas France and Spain were both still fully despotic, in the eyes of the British at least, fully despotic monarchies, absolutist monarchies anyway. So
Yeah,
there was a lot more freedom politically for the British colonies. And if you want to jump in and add bits at the end of each point, you can as well. So there was a lot more freedom for the British colonies, and like they had their own assemblies, and obviously with the policy of salutary neglect, they pretty much were able to run their own affairs. I mean, obviously that wasn't they didn't exactly see the world in the same way. The British and the American colonists when it comes to crunch, but I think that's also fundamentally shows that they had that freedom. I don't think there would have been any question in the Spanish and French colonies that they just obey whatever comes their way. I don't see them having, or they didn't have. Well, I suppose the Spanish colonies eventually did, but only
yeah,
after the American Revolution, so it had a model to go with in the first place. So I think that fundamentally is really important. The British had much more freedom, that there was direct control on the French and Spanish colonies from Paris, from Madrid, whereas the British colonies had that freedom to run their own affairs. And I think like political representation as well, like obviously 50% of American colonists could vote because there was much more land than there was in Britain. And that I think created a more dynamic political environment that the French and Spanish just did not have. Do you want to add anything to that
I
as well?
agree. Yeah, I think that the policy of salutary neglect is a really important one to mention.
Hmm.
That in fact, but I think there's a corollary to that, which is the British capacity for self-government, a political culture that favors self-government, and
Yeah.
that comes from Britain. That tradition doesn't or didn't exist nearly to the same extent among Spanish or French
Yeah.
colonies. So um, yeah, so that's a pretty big one. I think otherwise you covered it.
Yeah. So I think politically they're very different.
Yeah.
Can you see any similarities between them politically? I suppose you could look internally on the British colonies, they're politically similar because they're all set up on the model of Britain, governor representing the king or the power of the king in the state, and then a colonial assembly modeled on parliament with an upper and lower chamber. So they're pretty much like mini Britons. Um,
Yeah, and
they see
I think
themselves as Britons.
the attitude of the mother country is I suppose similar in some ways in that they're interested in trade and in leveraging the raw materials in the colonies, taking them back to the motherland,
Yeah, that's true. Although
mother country.
I'd have to under economics, but yeah, their motivation for
That's
being
right. That's right. But
there, I think, is true. It's the same. Um, although for different reasons, but I think that again, probably under economics is where we can get into that with the reason why they're there. Maybe a little bit so it's hard because Spain's one is not really economically motivated in the same way as the other two. It's a little bit,
yeah,
it kind of floats between social and economic. So
yeah, I agree. I
you
agree.
could take the political purpose of the mother countries. I mean, if you wanted to take it under political, you could, but I think it lends itself better under the other ones. But obviously, like the British were there to colonize. They took families across, they were there to settle. And that was very, very different. And that whereas the French were there for trade and the Spanish were there for uh, effectively for converting into Catholicism, and that impacted massively the relationship with the Native Americans. I mean, you could even give the relationship with Native Americans its own paragraph, but like obviously the British wanting land and the Native Americans having no concept of land brought them into conflict with the Native Americans in a way that didn't say with the French. Because the
Yeah.
Spanish didn't have that racism. If you converted to Catholicism, you were all right, like, regardless of what your race or ethnic grouping was. The British Protestants didn't really have that. And of course, the although the Spanish did enslave a lot of Native Americans, especially in Central and South America, less so in the North. But the French, because they didn't bring any women, they were only there for trading. They had good relationship with Native Americans because they intermarried and had they weren't really coming for their land, so there was not
Yeah.
some day-to-day conflict of interest between the French and Native Americans.
So I think that I mean that coheres with the basic point that the British colonies established more lasting political institutions, I think,
Yeah,
at least in the States, whereas among the Spanish and the French, it was much more temporary, I suppose. It was
yeah,
seen to
they
be
weren't planning on
controlled
staying.
by yeah,
The French just saw it for an exploitation of furs and fishing and resources, and the Spanish were mostly focused in Central and South America because that's where their gold and silver was. But like
indeed.
the British were
Yeah,
just, they were there to settle. A lot of them were fleeing, and it became the haven for people fleeing religious persecution. But I suppose we should talk about that more in social.
yeah. Do you want to turn to the social?
Yeah, we can do social second. So I would say socially, um, like I said, Britain was there to settle, so they brought their own families. So in terms of number of women, children in the British colonies was much higher than in the other ones. And I would say Britain had religious freedom. So like whereas obviously the mandated religion of French and Spanish colonies was Catholicism, and you couldn't go there if you weren't a Catholic, really. So because Britain was set up predominantly, like obviously by Puritans fleeing persecution in New England, and then I think Maryland was Catholic, a few of the other states with different religions, Quakers in Pennsylvania. So like there was no national religion, and there was that freedom to be whatever religion you wanted to, which was unique. I don't believe any country really had, and that's born out of Elizabeth I's like compromise between Catholicism and Protestantism, stopping
Well,
itself to
I
peace.
think that's true. I think that's true of the Protestant countries in general, because the
Yeah,
tendency of the tendency of Protestantism is in fact to splinter off and to turn into
that's
different
true.
factions,
Like,
different groups. And England, for many years, had to deal with Catholics, Anglicans, um, and more radical Protestants, separatist groups, right,
yeah.
like the Puritans. And I think that tradition, that diversity of religious opinion, carried over into the United States, into America, I should say, not the United States. We're
Yeah.
talking about the colonies
Yeah.
in 1740. So um, so I think that diversity is reflected. It's another difference, I suppose, but between Britain on the one hand, Spain and France on the other, and I think that difference is carried over into the colonies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like,
I think with the difference, sorry, if I was going to be a little more pedantic, I mean, England has the Anglican Church, and there was no equivalent. I think Anglicanism was, I think, stronger in some states than in others, but there was obviously it would have been impossible to create even a state church, like an Anglican state church on the model of Britain.
but I think
So
they've just,
Britain still has the Anglican Church.
yeah, it's uniquely tolerant though, because you think about most of the Germans were fleeing persecution. I mean, Germany was in what was 100 years, 30, was it 30 or 100 years of civil war in Germany over Protestantism versus Catholicism? Bloody
I
conflict,
mean, the 30 years war.
as well, yeah. Yeah. And then they had the bloody conflict over the religion there, and that caused a lot of the Germans to flee across the colonies. I think
Yeah.
socially, therefore, there was quite a big difference in terms of that. But I think that if you're looking population as well. Obviously, population growth in the British colonies was much higher because they were there to settle, and so like the populations were very tiny in Spain and France, and that meant they had to interact with the Native Americans. They didn't have the numbers, you know what I mean? So there was much more interaction. I think the relationships between the French, I would say, if you were to rank how good the relationship was between the colonies and the Native Americans, you would put the French at the top, then the Spanish and the British had the worst relations with Native Americans, I think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and like I said, that there was higher literacy in the colonies, more land ownership in the colonies because they had the ability to go there. I think, you know, and that creates a different kind of society, more, I wouldn't say egalitarian society, but moving in that direction because more people can participate in political life and in everything that they can do. Maybe that could have gone in the political category, but it could go in social as well. I think that there was much more opportunity in America.
Yeah.
And if you're looking between the colonies, I think socially it was quite different because obviously in the north was very puritanical, the northern British colonies. So like the Great Awakening and the drive for like, you know, hardcore Protestantism and really radical anti-authoritarian movement, which you can see then manifest itself in Massachusetts and the Boston Tea Party afterwards, I think.
Indeed.
Whereas in the South, obviously has a plantation slave owner culture, which socially does create a kind of segregated society between African Americans and whites in the South. And then the central colonies were obviously different. Like New York was Dutch, Delaware was Swedish, Pennsylvania has a huge German population. So they weren't really even that traditionally, they didn't have the same traditional ties to the motherland of language and culture as the rest of the colonies did.
Agreed.
Yeah. So I would say we didn't really do a conclusion on political. So politically, they're very different between the French, Spanish, and British. But I would say inside the British colonies on political, they're pretty much almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree?
Well, except for no, I mean, I think that the self-rule, I think there's a big difference between North and South in that regard. I think in the South, well, I mean, in Massachusetts, you have these Puritans. They have they have local government. They have, they rule themselves with using, with committees. They farm the land. They don't really rely on slaves. I think in the South you have these they're not aristocratic, but they almost seem like that. Big families.
Yeah, recreating the British aristocracy.
Yeah, it's a kind of quasi-aristocracy, isn't it? In the
So would you
South.
say the South is more similar to old school Britain, to the motherland?
I think that, yeah.
In hierarchy, and New England has a more egalitarian.
I don't know about that. No, I mean, I disagree just because in Britain itself, there's not a slave population. I think
there is South, there's definitely like an elite. You know what I mean?
You have in the South, you have this elite families that own huge plantations.
Yeah.
And they're also involved in the government, of course.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite different. It's quite different to the North. And so politically inside the colonies as well, there are some pretty big differences.
Yeah, and those elites I mean, diverting off the question, but those elites stay in power after the revolution as well, which is
unsurprisingly, huh?
Yeah, well, that was one of the reasons why in my dissertation, why I was arguing that Virginia was kind of written out. It didn't fit the social historian's idea that America was an egalitarian revolution.
Yeah, I think that's retconned a bit in light of subsequent events. Probably, maybe for patriotic reasons, but
after the Civil War, I put after some, and there was also a movement in the 20th century of Marxist historians trying to argue.
Indeed. It's funny because it's turning the other way now, like with the 1619 project.
Yeah.
But I think that traditionally a more patriotic attitude emphasizes the self-government of the Massachusetts kind of small town, and doesn't take into the plantations so much. Take into account the plantations.
Well, America likes to write its own history to make itself look good, and the South and the slavery to look good.
But now it's funny. Now it's sort of switched because if you're interested, the 1619 project, the attempt to say that America was established explicitly wholly on slavery is now really actually equating the southern style of
Yeah.
Across the country as a whole. So I
Yeah,
think
well, I
both
suppose they
sides
would.
are
I
somewhat
mean, slavery was in all the colonies at the beginning, including in the North. Like the North doesn't like to talk about it, but New York
no,
was.
it was, but not to the same extent,
No, because it
and it was
wasn't the
organized
economic.
in a different way.
Yeah, it
So
wasn't the economic model, but it was the
no, it
social.
wasn't exactly. It wasn't the economic model, which means that in the North it was easy to phase it out
Yeah,
pretty quickly.
yeah,
Whereas
because it
in the
was only
South,
affecting a few
it
small
was
people.
in that's right, and in the South it was absolutely integral to their system, to their way of life,
Yeah, that's
to the way that their institutions had formed.
yeah,
I think that reflects a really major difference
yeah. We've kind of rolling onto
between.
economics there, because obviously, economically, in the
Yeah,
British colonies, there was a massive difference. I think the biggest difference in the British colonies is on economics between the colonies. Whereas I would say there's differences on all three of them. We'll talk about which is the most important difference, like between the French and the Spanish. But okay, so obviously the British were there for multiple economic reasons. They're setting up colonies. They were there to trade, but they were also there to set up colonies. Found they had the plantation economies, but also fledgling manufacturing in the north. The French were there entirely economically for trading fur and fishing. They had very limited. It was just raw materials to trade out, which I suppose makes them similar to the mercantilist system. All three of them were kind of operating their own kind of mercantilism, because all the economies in the colonies were set up to benefit the motherlands. That's for sure.
yeah, and that's reflected in an important detail that trade between the colonies, each discrete colony traded much more with Britain than they did with each other.
Yeah.
So they had ports, they had a lot of infrastructure for shipping, but there weren't big trade routes between the colonies. There wasn't a lot of actually intercolonial communication at that stage.
No, but I mean, even though I was saying like with the Spanish and the French colonies, they're set up in the same way as British colonies, just to be exploited by the motherland. The target is to just
Correct. Yeah. So there's a key similarity.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas the difference was, I think Spain had Florida's economy was based on plantation growing because of the climate, so that's similar to the South. And I would say the French economy of fur trading, fishing is quite similar to the northern British colonies. So there's probably more similarities between the French, Spanish, and British on economics than in social and political.
Yeah, yeah, I
But
agree.
between the
Except for that,
colonies, between the British colonies is the biggest difference, because the South's an export-based crash crop economy, like doing tobacco, indigo, and rice, based on slavery, and the North is a small freeholder one based on fishing and trade, and with the intention of setting up shipbuilding and manufacturing, and was very much a focus on an import economy at that moment in time.
indeed.
So I would say the biggest divide, I would say economics is interesting because it's the most similar between Britain, France, and Spain, but the most different between the British colonies.
Yeah, yeah, agreed.
Would you agree? So overall, how similar or different were they then? What are we going to go with?
So we could say we can give a nuanced answer and say that in respect to politics, they were very different. They were both very different to the Spanish and French colonies, and also different amongst themselves because of the North and South.
Yeah.
We can say that socially they were also very different because of the religious tolerance.
Yeah.
Because of the diversity of ethnicities.
Yeah, and families as well.
Even at that stage.
Yeah, a number of
and different ways of life as well.
Yeah.
Between because of the and then I think we agreed that on the economic level there are some differences, but there are also quite a lot of similarities.
I think more similar between France, Spain, and Britain. I think there's more similarities economically than not. But I think between the British colonies, the North and South, economics is clearly the biggest divider in 1740.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think they would have seen themselves as socially and politically different, but they would have noticed the difference in their economic models.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they would have considered themselves as British.
Perfect. I think we smashed that one.
Yeah. Shall we start another one? So they just do little mini ones so that we can kind of run through. Like, so each one has its own little podcast, and because sometimes when it's too big, it doesn't actually save it for them to listen to. They will make it. So I have this one, and I'll call you back, and we'll do the next 10 marker.